piacere chiamare sul palco John Bell, che è della London Metropolitan University.
Can you hear me okay? Very good, very good. I firstly must apologize that I have very little Italian, so I will be making my speech today in English. Hopefully you have one of these, and now is a good time to use it, I think. But I have been spending a lot of time in Mexico recently. I'm due back there next month, and I've been obviously learning the wrong language, so apologies for that. This is my first time back in Rome for 25 years. Last time I was here, I proposed to my wife, so it's got some very happy memories. And thank you very much to Alessandro and to Stefano for inviting me to present at your conference today. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we all agree that we are living in a time of great volatility, of great uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We are living through a period where everything that we learnt about supply chains and trade in the last 20 or 30 years is being challenged. We are seeing that supply chain management decisions are being influenced as much by politics, ideology, as much by environmental concerns and ethics as they are economics. And I think that's been a huge change and a huge challenge for us all. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of context about those changes, certainly about the political changes, and then I'm going to be looking at other areas and why I believe that we are seeing, or we are approaching, a period of deglobalization. And of course, that is the theme of my book, The Death of Globalization. So on this slide, I've put it into a little bit of context, the history. When I started out as an international trade analyst back in the 1980s, the late 1980s, things were very simple. We were all on a path towards globalization. I was writing about the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which obviously became the WTO. We experienced the fall of communism. We saw the advent of the single European market, and in the USA and Canada, the North American Free Trade Area. And at that time, there were two books published, one called The End of History, the other, The World is Flat. And I recommend both books to you. They summed up the thinking of the time that the world was on this trajectory towards adoption of Western ideals, Western beliefs of democracy, but also free trade. We were on this path to liberalism. But when we came to the 2008-2009, we had the Great Recession. And in my mind, that changed everything. A few years before that, China had acceded to the World Trade Organization, and the rather naive belief was that if China benefits from the riches of globalization, not only will it engage with the global trading community, but it will eventually adopt Western democratic ideals. That has been shown not to be the case, obviously. So from that turning point in the Great Recession, China was able to use the riches it has amassed to project its own ideals throughout the world and its own economic power. At that time also, we saw around 2010, 2011, there were a number of major climatic and natural disasters which propelled risk onto the top of many manufacturers' and retailers' corporate agenda. Looking internally to the West, we also saw that there was a rise of populism. Large parts of society felt they'd been left behind by globalization. There was growth of rust belts at the time as production was shut down in Europe and North America and offshored to Asia, predominantly China. This created tensions, which President Trump, for example, was able to benefit from, and that resulted in more trade barriers, more protectionism being put in place. At the same time as that, we had the US and the China tensions growing as China flexed its economic and military muscles, and we're seeing that is still the case most recently with Taiwan being the main flashpoint. So I believe now we are very much on the pathway towards neo-protectionism, which is being driven by geopolitics, by domestic politics, by sustainability, environmental concerns, industrial policy, and risk. And in my next few slides, I shall explore that theme. So I've divided some of these deglobalizing trends or imperatives, forces, as you will, into four: economic, domestic policy reform, international security, and sustainability and ethics. If we look at economic forces, firstly, as I've mentioned, about 10 years ago, manufacturers and retailers really started taking notice of the impact of natural disasters upon their global supply chains. They saw that they were too dependent on many countries, mainly China, and they've started to diversify that risk, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. And then there are other factors. For example, lack of infrastructure capacity. We saw that very much the case during COVID, where the shipping industry was overwhelmed by demand. We've seen market volatility, again, most recently during COVID, when governments firstly started to stimulate their economies, and then with inflation running riot, they've started to induce recessions, obviously by increasing interest rates. I've mentioned already the vulnerability to natural disasters, which we've seen, energy crises as well, which was caused most recently by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These have created problems in society, which are leading to more strikes and blockades. And of course, during the COVID period as well, we saw shipping rates go sky high. There's been other political interventions as well, relating to currency rates, currency wars, as many countries try to make their exports more competitive. And then we have this issue of domestic policy reform. Many people in the world, many people in the West, believe that there has become a lack of democratic accountability. As I mentioned, this has resulted in the rise of populist politicians, with Brexit, for example, as well. But it's not just in the West where there's this levels of discontent about globalization. Developing countries also feel that they are being left behind, and that there is an unfair distribution of wealth around the world. This has been made worse by perceived tax avoidance by multinationals, and of course by the tariffs and trade wars predominantly between China and the US, but also including Europe and the US, and more recently, if we look at electric vehicles, the potential for trade war between Europe and China. These barriers have been put up for very good reasons, many people believe, and that is to protect local industry, to halt the increase of the so-called rust belts. But there are other issues as well. Many people in society feel that they are losing their culture, and immigration, which is an absolutely fundamental part of globalization, is the reason for this. I pass no personal comments on the values of these arguments. I'm just saying that a large proportion of people believe this to be the case, and they have become very much anti this globalist agenda as they see it. And then we have international security. As I mentioned, foreign governments and many countries believe that we have too much dependency on other countries, not just China, but also during COVID on India, for example, where a large amount of pharmaceuticals were being processed. At that time, India put an export ban on many critical drugs to the West. There's been the rise of geopolitical tensions. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which I've already mentioned, has created tensions around the world as China is using its economic, financial, and cultural leverage to push its reach throughout Africa, throughout Latin America, and also into many parts of Asia. One of the key areas that we're seeing of tensions has been the idea that advanced technologies are leaking or bleeding from commercial use in China to military use. And that has prompted the US, firstly with President Trump, but carried on by President Biden, to place export bans on advanced technologies, most notably semiconductors, to Chinese companies. This is leading to the creation of what I call dual supply chains, the idea of ally sourcing or friend shoring. So they are developing supply chains for China and China's allies, and supply chains for the West, the US, Europe, and its allies. International trade, international supply chains are also very vulnerable to cybercrime. The flow of data is now critical to international supply chains. Unfortunately, this makes it very vulnerable to disruption. And of course, there are other issues relating to terrorism, piracy, and also corruption. And then in my final category, sustainability. Many people, many politicians in Europe are very worried about carbon leaking. And what I mean by that is the offshoring of manufacturing to many emerging countries which have lower environmental standards than those in Europe or indeed in the US. Goods manufactured in these countries are then exported back into the EU. So there is no longer a fair, level playing field, as many European politicians see. And they want to address that by increasing the tariffs or placing a levy on goods moved back into Europe. And then there are global value chains, and many people believe that it's just crazy that many components are manufactured in multiple geographic locations around the world, are moved by air or sea to the next stage, another country where more value is added, and so on until assembly, which usually in the electronics sector anyway, takes place in China and then moved to the West. There's a huge amount of carbon emissions relating to this, which come from the shipping or the air cargo sector. There is also a lack of environmental oversight as well. If you're looking at lower tiers in the supply chain, it's very difficult to have a visibility of the environmental practices of suppliers, which may be in a very remote part of China, for example. The same can be said for responsibility for worker conditions as well, and I come on to that in a little bit. Of course, there are the costs related to climate change adaptation, which impact on all our businesses as well. So let's deal a little bit more detail about the economic imperative, as it were. Now, I'm sure everybody in this room understands the traditional relationship that has been in place between transport costs and production costs. Obviously, being able to leverage low-cost labor markets in China and the rest of Asia has really driven offshoring of production over the last few decades. Balance against that has been, since the 1950s, very low transport rates since containerization came into being. This means that manufacturers are very able to produce goods on the other side of the world and move them back to markets in Europe or North America. The result of that has been globalization. As one supply chain manager put to me, the reason why it works has been the reliability of the logistics industry. Logistics just works. Or at least that was the case until COVID, when logistics stopped working, at least on an international basis. We saw the shipping industry overwhelmed, particularly on the Pacific routes. We saw West Coast ports of America overwhelmed, congested. We saw intermodal and trucking as well in the US. Not just in the US, Rotterdam, Antwerp were having many of the same problems, although they were less well reported upon. So if you look on the right of my slide, I put the future scenario here. So we still have lower costs in terms of labor in Asia. But now what manufacturers and retailers are doing is that they are factoring in, they are building in many of the invisible costs, which I've already talked about, in terms of economic risk, in terms of the natural disasters, climate change, the security tensions, corruption, business process risk. By that I mean customs and trade processes, cargo crime, societal risks, cybercrime, and of course pandemics. So these once invisible costs are now being factored into the offshoring decision process. Add to that, we are seeing oil prices at very high levels. We're seeing capacity, certainly during COVID, not so much now, but being challenged. And we're seeing levels of unreliability, again through COVID, which has raised the issue at a corporate board level. So in the future, what I believe we're going to see is a rebalancing of globalization, which will look more like reshoring and nearshoring. So where is the evidence for this? Well, on this slide, I provide some data, some statistics. And if you look at the top charts there, the top figure, it shows the relationship between international trade and domestic growth. Now, up to that watershed moment, as I called it, when we entered into the Great Recession, that international trade was growing roughly at twice the pace of domestic growth. Since then, since that Great Recession, that has gone back to parity. So domestic growth and international trade have been growing at the same levels. There's also been a drop before COVID, but the last data before we entered the COVID period, where international trade was falling, and now we are seeing that same data show that we are dropping again in terms of international trade levels. Why is this? Well, for many of the reasons which I've already mentioned, There's trade tensions and protectionism. Import demand has declined in developed countries. Investment has focused on domestic infrastructure and stimulus, particularly in China. The one-off gains of offshoring have been lost. So there really isn't much more in way of manufacturing in Europe and North America that can be offshored to China, because most of that work has already been done. And increasing labor costs are also a major factor, which is reducing the differential, the competitive differential between emerging markets, many emerging markets, and the West. So just to dwell on that point a little bit longer, in blue there you can see the labor costs in China on an index with Germany, United States, and Mexico. And you can see that really from the time that it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, 2002, that labor costs have gone up very significantly. And that has reduced the rationale, the logic behind offshoring to that particular country. You can see that adjusted labor costs in Germany and the United States have remained fairly flat. But I think most interestingly, that if you look at Mexico, labor costs in that country have also remained very low, which means now that American manufacturers and retailers are looking very, very strongly towards Mexico when you take into account all those other issues that we had during COVID and the security tensions with China at the moment. Mexico has suddenly become a very safe bet. And that's probably one of the reasons why I've been asked to go across that country and talk there more in the last year than I have in the last 10 years. Also impacting upon labor costs will be automation and 3D printing, so part of the fourth industrial revolution. Automation will reduce the importance of low-cost labor. And if more manufacturers based in Europe and North America invest in automation, it means that they have the opportunity to produce goods very close proximity to their end market. During COVID, there was a change in thinking. Suddenly, labor forces were no longer an asset, they became a risk. And on top of that, we saw robots are getting cheaper, 3D printing is becoming faster. Also, another fourth industrial revolution trend has been e-commerce, and that obviously relies very much on high levels of efficiency, high levels of productivity in warehouses. So robotics and automation are a very good fit for the new e-commerce environment that we find ourselves in. What will be the consequences of this? Well, I believe that in the medium term, again, this is a force for reshoring and maybe near-sourcing with fewer intercontinental movements of goods, or relatively anyway. Just some more evidence that this is actually happening. This is a real trend. My company, Transport Intelligence, interviewed 300 supply chain managers earlier in the year, and 20% of them suggested that they would be moving production and sourcing out of China, so a very significant amount. About 20% of customers also surveyed said that they will reduce investments in China in the coming years. So this is a real trend. It is really happening right now. So my next two slides, I just want to talk a little bit about ethics and sustainability, which are also influencing supply chain decisions. Companies are realizing that although they may have outsourced and offshored production to emerging markets, that does not give them the right to outsource responsibility for their suppliers' workers. Now, the thinking changed very considerably at about 2011, when there was a major disaster in Bangladesh in the fashion industry, the Rana Plaza disaster, where over 1,000 workers died in a factory which was manufacturing goods for Western manufacturers and retailers. This was followed by significant bad publicity for companies such as Apple and other consumer electronics companies, when it was found that many of the workers employed in their suppliers were even driven to taking their own lives. So very, very bad publicity for these companies. So this bad publicity has been reinforced by steps by governments, and we've seen a lot of regulation recently, some related to modern slavery, some relating to the treatment of the Uyghur community in China. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act has come into force in the US, which bans the imports of goods which even touch that particular province in which the Uyghur community are forced into labor. And then in Africa, we have conflict mineral regulations as well. And that's really impacting upon the rare earth metals and critical resources which are so important to the green technology, electric batteries, vehicle batteries, as well as consumer electronics goods, all our smartphones, for example. But there are more problems ahead. So how would a global manufacturer deal, for example, with the treatment of democracy protesters in Hong Kong? So that may be even more impactful than some of the other issues which I've highlighted, as there is not only brand equity and reputation at risk, but there will also be regulations being put in place by governments. Just lastly on this slide, you can see that in terms of forced labor, modern slavery, it's believed by the International Labour Organization that there are more than 10 million people in Asia in forced labor, and those will impact upon global supply chains. It will impact on Western manufacturers who may not employ directly, but their suppliers will. So let's take a look at environment and sustainability, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation. I've mentioned that global value chains are being questioned in the way that goods will crisscross the world, adding value at every stage, but also increasing carbon emissions. I've also mentioned the fact that many people, many politicians in Europe are very worried about carbon leaking. As I say, offshoring of production to countries which have lower environmental standards. And the policy of this response of the EU in the EU has been very clear, making shipping more expensive through emissions trading scheme. I had a very interesting conversation last night over dinner, where it was asserted that actually what will happen from the emissions trading scheme, the ETS, will be that actually more volumes could be forced off shipping, a low carbon form of transport, and onto roads. So it may be counterproductive in many respects. We shall have to see. And then it come back to the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism as well, which is imposing levies on imports with high carbon footprints. The unintended consequence of that may be that it really disadvantages many emerging markets who will maybe rightly say, well, actually, we didn't create this problem of climate change, but we're being forced to pay the costs. The other side of the coin is subsidy and intervention. The US is subsidizing green technologies through its Inflation Reduction Act. What will be the impact of that? Well, it will create localized supply chains. It will mean fewer volumes being moved from Asia and Europe into the US as these supply chains are created domestically within US and maybe the North American Free Trade Area or the USMCA as it is now. So what are the consequences of this? Well, I foresee more barriers to international trade, more increased regionalization of trade flows, discrimination against emerging markets, more localization of manufacturing, and more cost pressures on international transportation. Just a couple of case studies to finish. Firstly, if we look at, I suppose this is a geopolitical situation and the tensions which have been created between China and the US in terms of technology. We're seeing a push, a very big priority both in the US but in Europe as well, to create its own semiconductor industry. So there's a possible £5 billion euro deal for advanced packaging and assembly chip factory, subsidized by the Italian government. There's potential investment by Intel. There's a new plant being created by ST Microelectronics in Milan. And this is all because Europe and the US want to reduce their reliance on Taiwan, given the threat which China offers to the Taiwanese. I didn't realize that the minister was going to be at the conference online earlier, so that's a happy coincidence. But he said in the past, there is a need for greater strategic autonomy at the European level by supporting investments in new technological frontiers, such as semiconductors, electric batteries, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence, all of which will create a competitive ecosystem both in Europe but also more locally as well in Italy. Then finally, a case study which results from sustainability pressures. This relates to an Italian manufacturer of denim clothing. Obviously, Italy has an enormously well-known and very prestigious fashion manufacturing sector. So you already have here the basis of a very strong textiles industry, but it could get even bigger. And that is because of the pressures that come, which will, from an environmental perspective, it is far better to source goods locally. And in this case, this is a manufacturer from a small region of Italy in terms of secondary materials, or from Spain for its virgin organic cotton. You'll see that the products are made very locally within 40 kilometers of its headquarters. And there is a focus on slow fashion, as they call it, and the circular economy, rather than fast fashion and globalized supply chains. The issue which they flagged up was that they need more expertise, they need more experience, and they need more support, which I think is, from a policy recommendation, is very good, not only for the fashion sector, but also for many other industry sectors as well. And one of the reasons for this is because multiple generations of offshoring have occurred, and so we've not only offshored production to China and Asia, but we've also offshored that experience and expertise as well in many sectors. So my concluding slide, just to wrap up. I believe there's a strong likelihood of fragmented supply chains, some developing in China and with China's allies, some with the West, some with the US, some which will become European-centric as well. We're seeing more reshoring, more near-sourcing due to the differential in labor costs, more automation, more trade barriers and local subsidies, more security concerns, the increasing prioritization of ethics and sustainability. I haven't mentioned digital decoupling, but we are creating more digital islands around the world through different legislation which is being enacted. And there are more national policies to capture supply chain value add on a domestic basis. What will hold us up? Well, high energy costs in Europe, and as I mentioned, a lack of production labor force scale and know-how in developed markets. So, in conclusion, I believe that reshoring and near-sourcing could be very positive for economies in the West and associated logistics industries, but not all countries will benefit, and it depends very much on openness in domestic policy and encouragement of investment. So thank you very much for this morning for your time. I hope that's been interesting and provocative as well. Thank you.